I want to talk about another method of pulling vacuum on an air conditioning system. So I have actually a portable vacuum pump, and you can see it's got a valve and hose connected to it. I've connected my manifold gauge set to it. So I just want to quickly do a review of the manifold gauge set. On the manifold gauge set, we actually have two gauges. The high pressure gauge, the red gauge, which will go from 0 to about 500 psi, and the blue gauge, which will go from 0 to about 150, 120 psi, depending on the gauge. It also has the capabilities of measuring vacuum. For that reason, it's called a compound gauge. So you can see on this particular gauge, I actually have the capabilities of measuring the amount of vacuum it's being pulled in the system. The module says another way to actually measure the amount of vacuum in the system is using a Micron gauge. And what I have connected in series with my vacuum pump and in my manifold gauge set is a Micron gauge. And basically what the Micron gauge is, it's a way of measuring the vacuum. And your module says ideally you want to pull 500 microns. As I mentioned to you before, at this altitude we won't be able to pull that kind of vacuum. So I should be able to pull somewhere about 1,000 to 700 inches or microns. So what I want you to notice is when I turn the vacuum pump on, you'll notice that the blue gauge will pull down on the vacuum. You'll notice the blue gauge will actually pull down on the vacuum almost instantaneously, but you'll notice how long it takes the Micron gauge to start reading. So I'll turn on the pump and I'll open up the valve, and notice that the blue gauge almost pulled into a vacuum immediately. But notice the Micron gauge, because it's a more accurate measurement of the amount of vacuum in the system, doesn't pull down as quickly. So I pulled down to 1,000 microns. Let's see if I can get 700. Looks like I might get 700. So at this point in time, the cool thing about this is I could actually shut off my vacuum pump. So I'm actually going to lock the vacuum in the system and shut the pump off. Looks like I went back to 1,000, but you notice it's staying. Now, one thing I want to point out to you is the module talks about one way I can tell if my system is leaking is pull it down into a vacuum. And you can see I'm not quite down to about 30 inches of mercury. I'm probably in the neighborhood of about 28. Now, the cool thing about using a Micron gauge is this. Let's say I lost 2 inches or 3 inches of mercury on that compound gauge. It'd be pretty tough to see if that needle actually even moves 1 or 2 spots. But the cool thing about this is you can see my LED stays lit. So now I could go off and finish, changing the oil or fixing my electrical problem while I'm checking for leaks, and I can come back and make sure the system is still holding the proper vacuum. So a Micron gauge and a vacuum pump.